Hey, what's up, Liron here. If you're struggling with creating a realistic painting or using realistic values, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can drop the colors basically and decide to focus on values and get a nice realistic result with an emphasis on we are going to be using colors, but we're just going to be using them differently, right? So instead of using fully saturated colors, our approach is going to be vastly different. Now, if you want to recreate my sketch and paint it together with me, I will put a link in the description box. You can get the actual sketch. And now I'm gonna do a bit of a hybrid wash here. So what you saw me do is using water in the areas that are gonna be light or white. And what this does is once I paint around these with my color, the paint is going to seep slowly into that area where I used clean water, but it's not going to fill it entirely, which means it's going to preserve its white color. So it's going to stay pretty much paper white with smooth edges. There are many, many ways to achieve or leave behind highlights and details, and this is just one of them. It's just one way where you can do a fun hybrid initial wash. So you see me using some blue, right? And I've been using the leftovers on my palette. I will use throughout this process quinacridone rose as well. I'm using French ultramarine for now, quinacridone rose, and a bit of a new gamboge type of yellow. Right now this was a bit of lemon yellow, but later on I'm going to switch and use the new gamboge much more. Okay, now you'll notice how my main concern here is just leaving that middle section light, okay? That's my one concern and my one purpose for this wash. Nothing here really is paper white except for the sparkles on the water. So I can cover pretty much everything, including the sky, and leave just a few very gentle areas where the waterfalls are. And by the way, I didn't even talk about the sea. Of course, this is from the Niagara Falls. I've been there several times in my life. Always was a really good experience. So I love this kind of a setting. Now, the thing that actually attracted me to paint this is the boat on the right with all the people on it, all those small details. Very interesting. I find that kind of a thing fascinating. So notice how I'm also taking my pace, right? You don't have to work fast, take your time. Now, the colors I'm using again are circling the gray, and this is a concept I talked about in other videos where you start with a gray and then you bring in some colors to stretch it out in different directions. So you stretch it out towards the blue, in this example mostly, and sometimes towards the red, sometimes towards the green too. There's a bit of a green feel to the water here. But the key is you're circling around the gray. And notice how, by doing that, you can let go of a lot of the stress that involves with what color should I use, right? What's the right mix? How do I match the exact color I see here? If you just decide from the beginning to kind of circumvent the notion of color altogether, you don't have to really think about these things a lot. And it'll give you a lot of freedom, which is what I'm aiming at here. Okay, now as for the water, they should obviously be darker, and I'm gonna keep it fairly light for this initial wash. Yes, I'm gonna go ahead and do some wet and wet just to darken some areas to the sides and to the bottom, but for the most part, this wash is not really representative of the final value of pretty much anywhere but the sky, I would say, and those waterfalls in the middle, obviously. Okay. So I'm trying to push it to be just a little stronger, just to make some preparation for myself for later, but that's pretty much it. Now, I'm doing a risky move here, so you'll notice around the waterfalls where the transition goes from dark to light, there are obviously smooth transitions there. And I'm trying to figure out how I can capture that. The paper is still wet enough and I sprayed a lot of water on it, which allows me to do this, what I'm doing right now, to bring back some of these trees and everything. But this is the point to be very careful and do this if you have good expertise in wet and wet timing. The key here is you still want the paint to be pretty wet, but not move. So if you just pre-wet the paper, it's going to be too wet. You give it about 20 seconds and it's ready to go. Okay, and then the paint you use, it's also very important to get the consistency right. So it has to be more towards the thick rather than the thinned out, but still not very thick. because you still want it to stay relatively light, I would say, in this stage. So I'm doing that. Being very careful. You don't actually have to do it this way. You can wait for it to fully dry and then do it and play around with the edges, but I decided to be a little more daring here. But I will say one thing. Notice how, again, the fact we're kind of disregarding color, it's almost like my video on the David portrait. Colors don't matter, you just use whatever kind of comes to mind. Almost in the same way, this is the thing that allows us to even paint it this way, with so much attention to, let's say, the values and the transitions. Because if you have color to take into consideration, you're adding a significant amount of, let's just call it what it is, stress when painting. So it's going to be much harder to get the result you want. Now, I know it looks like I'm working fairly slowly on this wash, and it's still the first wash, but it's actually because it's really important. Those waterfalls, once I'm starting to get the darks in, those will stay the same, and you want to see these smooth transitions for later. Okay, that's really important because that's what's going to make this painting. The key to me of this entire scene is that boat with all of the small, intricate, tiny, beautiful details and the people outboard and everything else as it contrasts with the waterfalls. That to me is the essence of the scene and the thing I'm trying to capture. And as long as I capture that, I should be good. And this entire wash is dedicated to that other section, the waterfalls and the smooth transitions. But again, going to be very hard to achieve this if you're trying to match everything, including the colors. Okay, it is possible, and I would recommend you give it a try as well, but just have that on a separate go, because right now we're working values, okay? But with a twist, it's not just black and white, because some people find that boring. We are including variations of gray. Okay, now you'll notice I have this beautiful transition of all of these, and by the way, now the paper is dry. I know it looks a little wet, it's fully dry. I'm not gonna do this next wash on a wet paper because it's gonna be too late. This is gone, it's done, it's dry. In fact, I dried it a bit with a hairdryer. Now you notice all of these beautiful variations of warms and cools. That's actually due to the colors I'm using. So I'm using M. Graham's French Ultramarine with Daniel Smith. If I'm not mistaken, it's Daniel Smith Quinacridone Rose. And this creates these nice granulations and separations. So the red color separates a little more, and it creates a nice little effect. This wasn't intended, but it happened, and I kind of rolled with it. Okay, now for the water. We're looking for a couple of things now. We're looking to keep them a little cool gray, so we are going towards the blue. And we're also looking to darken them, especially in the lower section. Now, this is the crux of the ugly stage. This is exactly when the painting reaches or begins to reach the ugly stage. Why is that? Because the boat that should be the darkest element in this painting right now is pretty much the lightest. And that looks awkward with the water. No matter how you rotate the picture, no matter how much you spin it in your mind, it's gonna look awkward. Okay? The water looks very dark right now. By the way, for the patterns of foam, I'm being quite random. I'm not following what I see in the reference photo. Okay, I'm kind of letting it, my instincts guide me. You can stay loyal to the source if you don't want to, think about it at all. Just follow what you see. I kind of broke away from my sketch in this example. I'm following it in some spots, but mostly not. So in any case, yes, this is by definition gonna look off. That's just how it is. You have to be patient. Look at the final result, okay? Look towards the final result. Now, I sprayed some water because I want to keep this wet for a little longer, and you'll notice I'm going to do something interesting in just a moment. I will feed it more paint, but I'm also going to take the entire paper and kind of rotate it 90 degrees. Now, here's the thing. The pattern of foam is generally speaking from left to right because of the angle of the painting. I'm just softening some edges and then we'll get to that. The pattern of the foam goes from left to right to left, not top bottom. Now at the point at this point of the painting where the gravity pulls it down, we need it from one side to the other. So I'm basically, again, rotating it 90 degrees and I continue spraying a bit with my sprayer. And what this does is using gravity, we're gonna get patterns that are left to right, aka horizontal. Okay, now this is still wet, and look at what I'm gonna do, because I felt like the water is, I kind of got caught up in the gray trap, and I did not pay attention to keep this a little more on the cool side, so I'm feeding the wet paint with more phthalo blue. Okay, I switched over to phthalo blue just to push it more towards the blue cool kind of setting. Okay. And guess what I'm going to do once I'm kind of done feeding it? I'm going to rotate it once again and let the things move more horizontally. But it's very important to remember, things are very wet at this point. I would never have done this phthalo blue feeding unless it was still quite wet. Not damp even, wet, because I'm using wet paint here. Okay. Now this is going to add even more granulations, which is going to look really good. Really interesting. So a lot of this process, I had a plan, but I am feeling through it. And here comes watercolor's second big lesson here that you want to maybe take with you. You have to dance with the paint. That's just how it is. You have to be cognizant of what's going on paper. Notice how everything is dry, by the way, 100%. And I'm pre-wetting to start light and then push it to be darker around the bottom, because I'm still not in the dark enough realm, okay? But you have to be cognizant of what's going on paper and tango, play, dance with it. You can't just go blindly into your plan without taking anything into consideration that goes on paper, because you may find opportunities, you may find mistakes, you may find tons of things. Now remember what I told you about the ugly stage. This is going to be the ugly stage on steroids, because right now it looks very dark. It looks super duper dark. The boats aren't dark, even the background kind of mountains aren't dark enough, and it's just gonna look awkward. Just admit it, and that's okay. What you can do to alleviate some worries is to take a picture of your own painting, turn it black and white, compare it to the black and white reference photo or to the original photo, and you'll see the water is not too dark. You will see that they're okay. It's just that you haven't darkened the other elements enough, okay? Now, I am, to be frank with you, looking at this, and I may be scared, right? I may feel, oh, maybe I went too dark. That's a very rational thought to have, but kind of let it dry and see what happens, okay? Just trust it's going to be okay. Worst case, you will fix it for next time. You'll do another attempt. That's okay. But you will get it, the balance right at some point. I used to tend to err always on the side of going too dark. I'll end up darkening everything too much. Then I went the other way, went too light, and I'm finding my balance. It's been a couple of years of finding the balance. Now, I decided to make use of this opportunity where everything is wet and just kind of connect the boat to this. Because I wanted to feel almost connected in a way. So I'm just using this fairly light paint, and I'm just continuing the wash. Now, the one thing I care about is there are some lovely windows that show through the boat, and that's a very nice effect to get where some gaps in the shape exist. So I'm very careful to just leave those. And it's such a beautiful effect because you have the boat that is pretty much white, and so it looks like all pale kind of gray blue. And then you have the dark details and the people that tend to be a little darker. And then you have the gaps. And that kind of layering of light, mid to dark, and then very dark is just a very nice effect. So I'm following that. I'm trying to capture that. Notice how, again, we're guided by values. So if you're struggling with getting the right value when it's an all colorful painting, just lower the saturation. Let more colors mix. Allow mud, right? Everyone's scared of mud. Just allow mud to exist and you're going to be fine, okay? And I'm doing, while this is still wet, I'm going with a very dark paint to get those darkest darks. Now, my mid values need to be darker. That's something I'm going to solve in the next wash. But for now, I'm getting these nice smooth transitions between the very darks and the mid values. Okay, that's going to be really nice. I'm going to set the people in. I'm going to put those details in the bottom. I'm going to even put in some of the shadows in the water if I can, and if it's still wet enough. And it's going to be nice. We're starting to move away from the ugly stage. We're not done yet. We're not in the clear because it's still, the values are still off. There's still, the context isn't complete, but we're getting there, right? We're starting to escape the ugly stage. That's how it is. You do it in parts. That's perfectly normal. So for the people, mostly dark. I don't know why that is. Probably because the boat's body is just white, so it's very light, so the people are just dark. The people are inside the boat, usually under some kind of a roof, and so they're in the shadow. That's a part of what's responsible for this effect. We do have this beautiful flag and a couple of mechanical, I would say, details on the boat. We're going to get those later on. The flag actually has some interesting details in it. The US flag, the red is very brown, kind of reddish, burnt red, and the blue is very gray, and that's going to be a nice effect we'll get later on. And by the way, you're going to be shocked what happens once I add the highlights on the water. I'm telling you, you're going to be shocked at how good this looks, okay? Just have trust in the process, like I'm having here. So now everything is dry. Everything was dry. You saw me doing the little tap to make sure, and I'm covering the mid values. I told you the mid values are too light, and the darks are okay. So I'm just covering everything with a flat wash while only avoiding the highlights. And that's a very common pattern for me to paint by, actually. I'll get the mid values not to be dark enough, but the shadows are okay, so I'm just covering it all with a darker glaze. You'll see this happen from time to time. And what's fun is you'll get the benefit of those smooth transitions where we put the darks wet and wet a second ago. You'll get the benefit of these still being there under this glaze we're adding right now. So the windows that are dark, still there's going to be a smooth transition. It's just a very fun way of doing things. Remember, you can switch up the order. You don't have to work light to dark always. You can work dark to light, light to dark, finish up the darks and then cover the rest with glazes, finish up the darks and cover everything with a thin glaze. It's not going to have a huge effect on your darks as long as you're using good paper, right? That's the caveat. If you're using a good paper, you can pretty much, abuse the paper and do light over dark and dark over light, you'll be good. If you're using pulp paper, not so much. So just be careful of that. Now this highlight under the boat doesn't really work, so I'm at some point just going to get rid of it. It's too light. I thought it's going to work, but not really. Now you have to kind of zoom out and look a bit at the entire picture right now, okay? Because you have to ask yourself, okay, what's next? Like, what's the next move, right? And I'm adding a bit of darkness where I see fit, where I feel like maybe it'll be a nice effect to get it even darker. So what's next? We have the boat on the left. We have the area around the waterfalls to the right and to the left that are a little darker. And we have the water highlights. That's something we're going to leave to last. All of the highlights. We're going to have highlights on the boats and the people as well. But that's going to be left to the last moments because, that's how it is. You have to keep the best part last. And that's kind of the jewels, as Joseph Zbukvich says. It's not the thing that carries out the painting. The thing that carries out the painting often is those big shapes we established. The reason why it looks so good when you add the small details is that it finally gives you kind of it's a finished piece of art. And then there's a flip that switches, there's a switch that flips in your mind, and you're like, okay, it's done. So yeah, trust me, it will work out really, really nicely. And by the way, this is the first video ever where I do proper color correction, so my blues don't end up looking purple. So I hope you'll enjoy that. My blues actually look like blues here, which is nice and more representative of what the final painting is. That, and again, once you'll see that, you'll love it. Trust me. So I mixed in a bit of phthalo blue into that dark mix that I had. Just to add a bit of shadows under that. And we're gonna start tackling the left section. Now, my idea is, again, I told you, right and left need to be darker to further close in on the waterfalls. My plan is to keep the mountain and boat together. So I'm actually gonna darken them fully together. My reference photo, as I was painting this, was rotated too. So that's a key tip for you if you haven't thought of that. When you rotate the painting, rotate the reference photo with it. Seems obvious, but maybe not for everyone. It's just very important because then you'll see things accurately. In fact, you'll see things more abstractly, which can work quite nicely to get the effect you want. So I'm going from slightly lighter to slightly darker, and in just 1 second, I'm going to connect it with the boat, where I'll just attempt to avoid a few highlights on the boat. You'll see. So I'm starting with the base of the boat, trying to get the shape accurately. I'm not going to beat myself too hard on it, but I will try, to get the bottom especially flat, right? That's the thing you're looking for. But look at this very subtle highlight I'm leaving, where I would say that's where the people meet the side of the boat. boat, or where the side of the boat turns to the top of the boat. Not really sure, and maybe it's a ship, not a boat. I'm not sure what the correct term is. But I'm just leaving a few of these gaps to just tell the story that it is a mechanical thing and it's in front of the mountain. Now, this is a little too dark, so my genius idea was, hey, let's spray some water over it. Now, it's funny because that ended up working in my favor, and you'll see it just one second. But I'm just feeding it a few very dark darks. I know it looks super dark. You can go darker, actually. Wet and wet, just for the windows and some details in the bottom. So that's what I'm doing here, being very careful, okay? Once I feel like it's starting to dry properly, I'm rotating. Otherwise, you may end up with a mess. You want to be careful of that. Because if you rotate too soon, all the paint's going to move down and mix in ways maybe you haven't planned for. Now, again, it's very hard seeing all those nuances of the darks within the darks, but trust me, these are necessary, and you see them. You see these just like on the other boat. It's pretty much a similar model, if I'm not mistaken. It's just that one is so far away. They look a little different, but I think it's a similar model. It may be different. I'm not sure. To me, it looks similar. But in any case, just to lighten things up a bit, I'm going to spray some water on that. And I did end up having a few large droplets in the water sprayer. That can sometimes happen, which can screw up the result. But I took it with a stride, and you'll see. If you've been there, you know one thing. I'm just kind of merging it with a bit of a darker tint under the boat, under the water. It's almost a combination of a reflection and a shadow. But if you've been there, you know how wet it is, right? That's why everyone has these little plastic raincoats, whatever you call them. So the fact that I sprayed and got some big drops in, and they'll get visible in just a second, and once it dries, was actually a big advantage because it gives this entire thing a more wet look. Look at the left section there. So it ended up working really nicely. I wasn't planning for that, but it looks really good. So let's celebrate that little win. And now I'm going to darken in, close in on the waterfalls. Again, if you take a few steps back from the reference photo, and I'll probably include in the link below also a posterized photo, a bunch of different versions of it, you will see that it is important to make them lighter, to make the waterfalls and the foam and everything, this spraying water lighter. You need to close in with some darker details. And it would have been very hard, yet possible, to get these in the first go. I'm just not skilled enough, I guess. But it could be done if you're really skilled and you're able to see these as abstract shapes. It's definitely something you could get done. And I am adding a bit of details, kind of indicating the falls shape. You have to just carefully observe the shapes. I just noticed there's a vertical shape that hits into the foam, but you have to make sure to leave enough gap for the foam to appear under it. So don't move these all the way down to the bottom, all the way to the boat, right? You need to leave some white foam underneath these brush marks I'm putting. Now, I'm at the risk of starting to get these details overworked, so I have to be really careful. I'm bringing in some water just to keep things smooth, and I'm just trying to keep this to a minimum. Again, don't fall into the trap of overwork. This is the background. The beauty here is the smooth transitions. You don't want to break that illusion, right? You probably won't break it unless you go real too extreme on the details, because we already set it up quite nicely. Now, as for the flag, I told you it's kind of a brownish burnt red for the stripes, and then for the bluish section, it's just going to be a nice little blue there that is very muted for the top left corner. Very beautiful version of a flag because it's very muted and in the background. So I like that quite a bit. I like how it turned out. Actually quite proud of that. And now it is time, because we closed in on the right side, we closed in on the left side, we have the boats, we have everything. It's time for some highlights. The water is as dark as it needs to be. Now, if you zoom in on the reference photo, download it, look at it up close, because obviously it's a bit hard to see in the video, because I have it in the corner. You will see some of these highlights. Now, I'm using John Brilliant, which is a warm-ish color for these highlights. I don't know why I felt like these need to be warm, but when I move to the foam on the water and the sparkly light on the water, I'm going to switch to my designer's gouache, okay? So I'm using a combination of both of these. I feel like the water is more of a neutral white, whereas the highlights on the people benefit from being a little warm, Okay, now if you want to see the exact paints I use, brushes, etc., everything is going to be in a link below, freewatercolor.com/gear. You'll see everything there. So just saying, if you want to see exact colors, right? Not that it matters as much, because remember, the entire idea is colors don't matter here. We're going beyond colors and making full use of values. Now we're going to start adding these sparkly bits. These look fantastic. Like, they really put everything, or start to put everything in the right context. I was amazed by how big of an impact that it has. And again, it's your brain is playing tricks on you. It's like, oh, okay, so now it's finalized. It looks much more believable in a way, right? I think my mind was missing some of these sparkly bits because the water and the setup just calls for it. Usually when you paint against the light, which is kind of what we have here, it's a very diffused light. It's a bit cloudy and foggy, but still, it's pretty much against the light. Just invites sparklies on the water. I've seen so much of this in our trip to Venice we just got back to about 2 weeks ago. It was fantastic, and I've seen a lot of that. So yeah, these sparkly bits do matter, and I kind of add a few of these trails that you see from earlier, you know, that move very horizontally. Again, remember, the water is quite horizontal. So it's a nice thing to be minded of, okay? Right to left, left to right. Don't go too vertical in the water. It's going to break the impression. I do see this mistake done from time to time, okay? Look at how nice the left side looks when it's wet like that. That is just a perfect effect. And knowing this, I would have made more use of it on the right side too. I just love that because everything is wet there. If you've been there, you know everything is wet there. And I love how the boat on the left is quite loose, impressionistic, while the one on the right, you can start telling a bit more details. But this entire thing is quite loose and impressionistic. It's quite a small piece of paper too. This would be a nice and interesting one to develop into a larger piece. But in any case, we're going to remove the tape, expose the final result, which I think looks just fantastic. And I want to thank you so much for watching. I do want to thank you. I really do appreciate your support. Be sure to check out the frustration-free watercolor course, especially if you want to learn how to paint like this, a little loosely, a little more freely, if you feel like you're too rigid. And I will use this opportunity to hugely thank everyone who supports me on Patreon. Could not thank you enough for this. Really means the world to me. And I will see you in the next vid. Until then, take care.